Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our fifth Jewish Studies public program for this academic year of 2020-2021. I'm Chavati Rosh Samuelson, and I'm the Regents Professor of History, and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, as well as the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. Let me say a few words about the center to those people who are not familiar with us. The Center for Jewish Studies at ASU is a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience through the ages. And we cover diverse philosophical, theological, and political perspectives that bear on the study of Judaism. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry and intellectual innovation as we disseminate information about Jewish culture, and our intent is to enhance the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix and around the world. We are now 9 months into the coronavirus pandemic, and that, of course, has upended the life for everybody all over the world. And like all other civic and cultural organizations, the Center for Jewish Studies has had to move its public programs from in-person to online mode. So this semester, we have offered 5 lectures online already. This is our 5th. It's all part of a series called Jews and Judaism Today, Some Burning Issues. And we begin with a lecture on the future of gender in Jewish organization by Professor Madeleine Ailman. That was in October 14th. Then we had another lecture of Professor Cheryl Greenberg from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, on Jews, race, and civil rights. And our third lecture was by Dr. Timothy Langille from ASU, who focused on celebrating Purim in DP camps, how survivors performed their trauma. And the fourth lecture was by me on Judaism and the ecological crisis. That was on November 19. So as you can see, or as you can hear, all of those topics explore issues of interest to our Jewish community today. And the topic tonight on Jewish genealogy, especially post-Holocaust genealogy, is going to be very much in the same vein. Let me just mention that next semester in spring 2021, we will hold 2 research conferences. One will be on anti-Semitism in comparative perspectives. That's in January 25th to be precise. And another conference on Judaism and climate change. That's going to be on February 28th. In addition, we will also have 3 webinars that will explore the meaning and relevance of Jewish studies for Jews and non-Jews today. So you can get all the information on our website, as well as it's available also on the calendar of Jewish studies that has been mailed out to all the people associated with Jewish studies. Tonight, I have the pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Janet Silverman, who is well known to many people here in Phoenix, since she's been a director of religious schools in several congregations and has been very active as an educator. She is also a professional genealogist and an editor, a writer and an editor. She holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Spertus Institute in Chicago. Her dissertation, the title of which was In Living Memory, was written under the supervision of the late Byron Sherwin. And that dissertation explores her family journey from Europe to the United States. And it's a story that she takes over from 1880s to 1920s, while contextualizing the life of the people involved in the story. And that dissertation was done in 2013. Currently, Dr. Silverman is a senior genealogist research team manager at Ancestry. And you have, of course, the famous logo of Ancestry and she works for the division of genealogist. She conducts private research for individual clients. Her research team of 10 people specializes in Eastern Europe and Jewish research in general. And her work involves her with a lot of travel, at least when travel was still possible, both domestic travel and international travel. And that's because she needs to get to the archival material in various places all over the world. She also speaks in many conferences, and now she has to do it, of course, virtually, but before it was done in person. And she has published various essays in places such as the Association of Professional Genealogists Quarterly, the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, and other specific genealogical publications such as Avotenu and the Galizianer. Most recently, she wrote Genealogy at a Glance, Finding Eastern Jewish Ancestors, and it is part of the Genealogy at a Glance series. This evening, she's going to talk to us on a very interesting topic. The lecture's title is Lost in the Shoah, the Rescuing Power of Genealogy. So I'm going to turn off my video and I'm going to mute myself so we can all hear the lecture from Dr. Silverman. When she's done, I will start asking a few questions just that we can start the conversation. And if you have a question to her, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Lisa Kaplan will give us those questions, will present the questions to Dr. Silverman. So without further ado, let's all listen to Dr. Silverman.
Thank you so much, Chava. I really appreciate being invited to be part of this series. Thank you all for joining us this evening. One of the most emotionally difficult and yet rewarding parts of my job as a genealogist is research into Shoah records. I don't know whether this resonates with any of you, but while I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, I often asked my grandparents if there was family in Europe, and the answer was generally a very curt no. My mother's family left Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1910, and my dad's family between 1900 and 1930, so that sounded about right. There was no one remaining. As a child, it didn't occur to me to ask anything more probing. Later, though, I asked about people who might have remained in Europe and been murdered during the Shoah, and the answer was the same. There was no one there. As an adult and as a researcher, I found a different story and discovered my own family and what happened to them. Working on behalf of clients, I frequently am asked to find people whose names aren't remembered. A client might say something like, my grandmother had 7 siblings who stayed in Europe. I think one of them was Shmuel, but I don't know other names, including last names. This to me is heartbreaking. Our grandparents certainly knew the names of their siblings and their aunts and uncles, and it was possibly too difficult for them to speak of those lost in the horrors of the Shoah. The unintended consequence, though, is that we don't know their names. We can't name children or grandchildren after them or mention them by name. My job is to find out what I can and put names, often to faces, in photographs. We're going to look at a very specific case and discuss what I knew going in, what work I needed to do to find answers, and how you can use some of these same resources to search for your own family. Research into the Shoah is, like all research, filled with unexpected finds and frustration when we don't find what we're looking for. The unexpected could be pleasant, finding people who survived and their descendants, but more often, of course, the findings are tragic. Even the tragic, though, for me, is wonderful because it means that I've found names of people who might have been forgotten. We have an obligation to remember. I consider it a personal mission, whenever possible, to find those who died during this tragic period and reunite them with their families so that there can be a memory connected to a name. Now, the map on the left is, as it says, pre-World War I Europe, when Galicia, part of the Austrian Empire, still existed. As is often the case, I started with very little information. I knew that Morris Schwell came to the US in 1914, and he was born in a very vague, undefined place in Galicia. His father was Aaron and his mother was Pearl. He had a brother, Paul, who married Regina, and Morris had several sisters, but my client didn't know their names. They never left Europe. One sister, though, had left, and she was in a concentration camp, survived, and ultimately wound up in the US. Her name was Rivka, and she was also known as Regina in the US. So there were two Regina Schwells in the US. Confusing. In order to get further, though, I needed to first expand on what we knew from US records. Why? Well, I didn't know anything about where Morris came from, only that his name in Europe probably was Moses or a variant of it like Moishe or Movsha. His gravestone clearly told me that he was Moshe Tzvi and he was the son of Aaron. I didn't know where the family was from, only that it was Galicia. I needed to pinpoint the town. I also didn't know anything about Regina, other than that she arrived in the US after the war and seems to have had several surnames, Schwell, Winevsky, and Reuben, as you can see on her death certificate. Now, who was Morris Schwell? Besides the fact that he arrived in New York in 1914 and he was from Galicia, we needed to know more. You can't find someone just with that limited amount of information. Well, we found out from his declaration of intention, which was the first step in those days, by the way, in applying for US naturalization, what his occupation was. We also found a physical description and information about his arrival. His ship manifest gave me the name that he used as a passenger, Moses Schwell, and that his closest relative still in his hometown was his father, Aaron, and best of all, it told me Aaron's address in Krakow. So now I knew the name of the town. Then I found information about Paul. His declaration of intention told us the name under which he arrived in the US, Pincus. That's important because our relatives didn't use names like Paul and Morris in Eastern Europe before they emigrated. They used their Yiddish names or variations of it. Sometimes the names were translated into Polish or Russian and came up with a variation of those Yiddish names. But if I don't know the Yiddish name, I'm not going to find them. So now I knew more, and this was really enough to get me back into Europe. Eastern European Jewish records are divided by town, type of record, and time period in the archives. Just knowing that the family was from the province of Galicia in the Austrian Empire before World War I would not have gotten me very far. I'm going to show you some pieces of records that I've cut apart because if I left them intact on the screen, they'd be way too small for you to be able to get any of the information. This is from a 1921 census in Krakow. Morris's father, Aaron, lived in Krakow, and he was a widower. He was born in 1865 in a place called Wielopole, and he had lived in Krakow since 1901. Wielopole is a small town, and it's not very far from Krakow. Like many other places, the town name isn't unique, and there are quite a few towns all over Poland with the same or similar names. So one of the challenges is to determine which of the towns the records refer to. In 1921, Aaron had two daughters living with him, Helena and Regina. Regina is probably the Rivka we're looking for. Helena is another sister. Like him, they were also born in Wielopole. I started looking for the Schwell family in records from the Shoah, hoping that I wouldn't find any and instead would discover that the family had fled somewhere and after the war, for some reason, gotten out of touch with the rest of the family in the US. But that wasn't going to be what I found. The first thing I discovered was this card. It's part of a collection that's a list of names concerning relocated Jews from the city area of Krakow. And I got this record from the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's part of their collection. Sorry. hit a button by mistake, part of the technology challenges. There were many supporting documents that we discovered. This was a protocol, the registration form. It was written on the 2nd of August, 1940. And it says basically that in the office of the Jewish community in Krakow appeared Shmuel Aaron from Krakow, residing on Chiemna 6, and the witnesses Simcha Soroka, a glazier residing in Krakow, and Marcus Pachter, a merchant also residing in Krakow. The witnesses stated the following: Shmuel Aaron, born in 1865 in Wielopole, District Dąbrowa, civil status married, occupation none, from Krakow, residing in Krakow on Chiemna 6. And by the way, the building Chiemna 6 still stands. I've been there several times. So the first question comes up. Aaron was a widower in 1921 on the census. Now in 1940, he's married. But we found more. Aaron himself testified that there were 5 people living in his home in addition to him. His wife, Perla, born in 1890, his daughter, Frida, 2 of her children, Casil and Sarah, and Kalman Patzenbaum, whose identity as the son of Aaron's brother-in-law isn't clear. Also unclear is Sarah Schlinger's identity. Was she really the daughter of Frida, or was she the wife of Casil? The document said she was married. If she was in fact Frida's daughter, what was her married name and where was her husband? Another question that has nothing to do with the information that's actually in the document is the numbering. You can see to the left of each of the people's names, instead of being in numerical order, starting with 1, it's 2, 5, 3, 4, 1. Doesn't make any sense. Male and female's names, nothing quite lines up. It's just a curiosity. This is, by the way, a picture of Aaron Shmuel. And until we found it, the family had never seen a photograph of him. An eviction notice was entered on February 20th, 1941, and they were to be out of their home on February 27th. They were given a week. But we found this letter in the file. It says it was from Pearl Shmuel. It had her address, Chiemna 6. It was dated February 28th, 1941, but I don't think that that was the date that the letter was written. It wouldn't make any sense if that was the date. It says, referring to the order of eviction received today for 27 February, I'd like to ask you respectfully, along with my husband, Shmuel Aaron, and daughter Schlinger, Frida, and it has an address, to reverse the order of eviction on the ground of I'm bedridden for a long time as a result of lung tuberculosis. Now I have lung inflammation with high temperature. Therefore, I have to be transferred to the Jewish hospital. Therefore, I'm not completely able to endure the transport. In my illness, my husband is taking care of me, and my above-named daughter takes care and feeds us because my husband is 76 years old and not able to work. I implore you to review my health condition through an examination conducted by the office's physician and leave us in Krakow up to the decision time. This letter is heartbreaking. She obviously doesn't know what that eviction is. She's telling them she's too sick and asking for mercy. That doesn't end well. It says your request is denied. And it tells her to show up on February 28th at 8 o'clock in the morning with her personal documents and food supplies for 3 days, as if they're going on a 3-day trip. I suppose on some level they were going on a 3-day trip. So after looking at the records, I had a lot of questions about the people. Well, if Morris was born in 1893, remember that's the guy we started with, how can Aaron's wife Pearl be born in 1890? And if Morris's mother was Pearl, who's this Pearl? Is Frida Schlinger, born in 1888, one of those unnamed sisters? that the client was interested in finding out about. Are Cecile and Sarah her children? And if Sarah's married, who's her husband and what's her married name? We went searching in person in the archives in Poland to find the answers to this. We knew Aaron was widowed by 1921. He'd been in Krakow at that point for 20 years. He was born in Wielopolli, as was his daughter Frida, as was Helena and Rivka. And then we've got this wife born in 1890. Was she the second wife? If she was the second wife, when did his first wife die? So I went to several archives looking for records of the Schwell family in Wielopolli and Krakow. I found records of the family living in Krakow in the Krakow archives. I have not yet found any records of the family in other archives, although I found a lot of records saying that Aaron and Frida, Helena and Rivka were born in Wielopolli. I haven't found any records of them, of an event like a birth in Wielopolli. I had hoped that I'd find these, and through finding them, I'd learn more about Aaron, like his parents' names, and perhaps more about the greater Schwell family. I did find a few other people named Schwell associated with Krakow. They may all be related, but I haven't figured out a connection between them yet. And this is the outside of one of the archival buildings in Rzeszów, the picture all the way on the right. On the top left is the archive in Sanek, Poland. The bottom left is a piece of the door in the Krakow archive, and inside are nicely and neatly arranged is the very modern archives in Rzeszów. Most of the archives in Poland don't look like that. Now, this was her first surprise, Frida's marriage to Saul Raphael Schlinger. Why was it a surprise? We already knew that Frida married somebody named Schlinger. But this record wasn't the marriage of Frida Schwell. It was the marriage of Frida Schertz. Her parents were Perla Schertz and Aaron Schwell. What it told us was that Aaron's first wife was also named Perla, and that Aaron and his first wife Perla didn't register their marriage with the civil authorities. They had a ritual marriage only. The law in Galicia, part of the Austrian Empire where Krakow was located, prohibited children born of a marriage not registered with the civil authorities from using their father's surname. And on their birth records, they were marked as illegitimate. Our research goal was to identify Morris's siblings who remained behind. Now, at least, we have a name that we should be looking for them under. But right now, we're going to find out more information about Morris's sister, Frida. Frida and her husband, Saul Schlinger, had at least 4 children. We couldn't find any records of children born after 1921 because those are privacy protected. Actually, the 1921 record is 2, but we found some information through speaking with some friendly people. We knew Frida's mother had died prior to the 1921 census, and we made an assumption that Frida's mother, Pearl, had died after Frida's daughter, Sarah, was born in 1916. We figured if Perla had died earlier, Sarah would have been named for Frida's mother. Since Frida had a daughter named Perla, born in January 1921, we continued to search for Frida's mother's death record, knowing that she died prior to the beginning of January. Again, this is an assumption based on Eastern European naming patterns. So all of those weird cultural quirks that we celebrate as part of our Jewish culture and heritage actually have a purpose for our research as genealogists, to find the families, to find information about them using what we already know about Judaism. Perla Schertz actually died in April 1918. Tragically, she died of tuberculosis, the same thing that afflicted her husband's second wife, who was also named Perla. Now, back to Frida's daughter, Sarah, and her story. She's born in 1916. By 1940 or 41, she was already married. Why don't we know her married name? And where was her husband when that protocol, that questionnaire, was enacted? Well, we found more information. This form is called a questionnaire for the movement of the Jewish population of Krakow, and it was part of the file that included the protocol. It answered a lot of questions about the family. We knew that now that the head of the family, Aaron Schwell, we knew that before, but we knew now that her last name was Schlinger. And by the way, I could not pronounce it until I saw it written in Hebrew. Her birth name was Sarah Schlinger. She was born in 1916 in November in Krakow. She was a Polish citizen and married. These records give the most incredible information about a person's residence, about their livelihood, how much money they have, what their occupation is, who they work for, a lot of personal stuff. On this page, it tells us that she's living on Zakopane Street, number 21, first floor, door 10, on the side of the house. Very specific. She's resided in Krakow since her birth, and she's a shop helper in her mother's business. It turns out that her mother owned a confectionery shop or something that used sugar. Most of the places that the family lived in Krakow are still standing. I've been there. I've been to each of the places, except for this one place. That whole street was razed at some point, and new buildings are on it. And it tells the date of the resettlement instruction, February 20th, 1941, to take place on February 27th, 1941. Now we're going to skip ahead in order to get to more of Sarah's story. These records are from the mandatory Palestinian naturalization files. That is, from the period of the British mandate. Doesn't mean you have to. By saying mandatory, it refers to the British mandate. It says that Mendel Wimschliner, whose wife was Sarah Schlinger, was applying for naturalization. It says further that they have a daughter named Rachel, who was born in July 1939 in Krakow, and that Sarah and Rachel are abroad. The handwritten letter says, since the applicant's wife was a former resident of Palestine, she may be included in his naturalization certificate when granted. You will observe that applicant's wife left with a child who was probably born in Palestine. The type letter, however, says that Mendel arrived in Palestine in 1937 and his wife left Palestine in March 1939 to go to Poland and didn't come back due to the war. Their daughter Rachel was born in Poland. Neither Rachel nor Sarah have returned to Palestine. And then we found what was a most shocking document, an application for a get. Although by the time we found this, we were pretty sure that Sarah and Rachel were murdered, it was still chilling to find out. The rest of the story of Sarah and Mendel isn't much happier. So the application for the get is from Menachem Wimschliner, son of Mordechai David HaKohen. And by the way, Menachem Wimschliner, on some records he's Mendel, some he's Menachem Mendel, of course, being a double name. His wife is Sarah Bat Raphael Schlinger. Witness was Michael Bobker from Kfar Sirkin, which was where Menachem was living. This is dated 1945, and it says that he's a driver born in 1916. He immigrated to Palestine in 1937, and Sarah, his wife, was born in 1916. Her father was Raphael. She stayed in Poland. They married in 1937 in Krakow, and their daughter Rachel was born 1939 in Poland. And they had a letter. a notarized letter from a clerk in one of the government offices in the town where Menachem Mendel was from. And it was in response to a letter, to an inquiry from his sister Leah. And it says, I have nothing happy to say. None of the family of Madame is alive. Salsa, nickname for Sarah, hid during the mass exterminations by the Nazis, but later it was found out that she too died. Mendel received a get in 1946 and in June of 46 married Fanya Berinsky. They had a daughter who they named Rachel, born in December 1946, probably named after her murdered sister. The peculiarities of his second daughter also being named Rachel, like his first daughter, was when we found mention of her in a record, before we found her birth record and before we found Fanya and Menachem's marriage record, was that we thought that this meant that somehow Sarah and Mendel's daughter Rachel had survived and wound up later on in Israel with her father. But that wasn't what the record said. It wasn't what the documentation proved to us. On Mendel's sister Leah's matzeva at Segula Cemetery in Petach Tikva, there's a memorial to her brother, in memory of my dear brother Menachem Vim Schlinger, son of David HaKohen, who fell in the war of 1948. So we know that he died very young, not too long after the birth of his second daughter. And these are photographs of Menachem Mendel and Sarah. I have a really odd view of this tragedy. He lived long enough to leave behind a daughter named Rachel Wimschliner. Now we come to the second of the challenges. Morris had a sister, Rivka, who came to the US after the concentration camps, after surviving, and she became known as Regina. I could not find her anywhere. I searched high and low. I looked in all sorts of ship manifests arriving in the US after World War II. There were ships that arrived very slowly until 1949, when all of a sudden legislation allowed people from displaced persons camps to be brought to the US. We thought since she came to the US after the war, and my client said he didn't think she came right after the war, but it was a few years later. But she was certainly in the US in the 50s. We looked at all of these manifests and we could not find an arrival of anybody with the last name of Schwell or Schwell or Swell or any other variation of the name that we could think of, that we could say definitively was Morris's sister, Regina. Then we found that she didn't go right to the US after the war. She went to Israel first. She arrived there in 1950, remained in Israel for 5 years, and then by 1955 came to the US on El Al Airlines. What happened then? Well, Regina married Harry Winefsky in 1957. That's the Winefsky that's on her death record, but it's on her death record only as an alternate surname. When she died in 1982, her surname was Rubin. Harry had died in 58. Regina married somebody named Shlomo Rubin. I haven't found the marriage record, so I don't know exactly when the marriage took place, or for that matter, where it took place. But Shlomo died in 1980, and he's buried in Israel. Regina died in the US in 1982, and she's buried in Israel right next to Shlomo. So we found some tragedies but we also found names. My client didn't know the name of Helena. He didn't know the name of Frida. He didn't know any of Frida's children's names. And by the way, in case you're wondering, Frida's husband died long before the war, Raphael, and she married again, and he's not on any of the documents that we found. But the person that was identified as the son of Aaron's brother-in-law, it's probably the son of his son-in-law, because that last name is the same as the last name of Frida's second husband. The research, as you can imagine, was tear-provoking on a good day. On a bad day, I couldn't see straight. My team, many of whom are not Jewish, learned a lot about the Shoah during this project. They learned about the records at the Errolson archives. They learned about the records at Yad Vashem, especially the pages of testimony. They learned about the records at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And because they were with me researching the family in Krakow and going to all the places the family lived, and even visiting the small town of Vilopoli, they became really emotionally connected with the family. They remembered them. We don't know them, but we remember them. We took them into our hearts, and we know their names. I work for Ancestry. It's a really big company. You are probably very familiar with Ancestry.com, the trees, the shaky leaf hints, maybe the DNA tests that we do. But I'm really proud to be working for Ancestry. These Holocaust collections are available free to the public in perpetuity. Ancestry made a commitment a number of years ago to digitize and index a lot of the records at the Errolson archives. That's the former International Tracing Service located at that Errolson, renamed Errolson Archives. And those records are free to the public and will remain free to the public. The Holocaust collections got over 25 million records. Ancestry's partnered with other agencies like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, like the JDC, to help bring at least the indexes for the records more accessible to the wider public. Sometimes you might have to write to the agency to get the records because all you can see is the index. But without the index, finding the records is close to impossible. Now, the Errolson Collection includes a wide variety of records, including passenger lists, lists of people from DP camps who came to the US, who went to Australia, to South America, to Canada, to England, to a lot of different places. They have lists of those persecuted from 1939 to 47 and registers of people living in Germany, people whose citizenship in Germany were revoked. It's fascinating. If you take a look at the Ancestry website and you go to catalog and you put in the word Holocaust, you're going to come up with a huge number of records, and you'll see that they're free to search. If you put in Jewish, you'll come up with a whole lot more records. Some of those are free, some of them are not. Ancestry's got a collaborative relationship with Jewish Gen also, and you'll see the index or a piece of the index, not the full transcription, on an Ancestry search, and then it gives you all of the information that you need to go to Jewish Gen and do a more comprehensive search for the people that you're working for. In genealogy, we often talk about best practices, including an exhaustive search. Exhaustive does not mean until you fall down in a faint. It means that you've researched until you can't find any more records. And these are some of the places that you can go to find those records. Now, I was talking about the records from the Errolson Collection that are freely available. That's at this top link, ancestry.com/cs/always remember. And that's where you'll find all of those records from that partnership. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has searches that you can do, and you can request records from the Errolson archives through them. The same with Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem's got the very interesting collection of pages of testimony, biographical sketches, some more detailed than others, that survivors, researchers, neighbors filled out to remember those who were murdered in their families, in their towns, people they knew. Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem has marvelous collections of records, including naturalization records and other records, not just of Jews who settled in Israel, but a wider span of Jews and things pertinent to Jewish history and the world of Judaism. Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, also in Jerusalem, at one of the Hebrew University campuses, Jewish Gen, of course. Jewish Records Indexing Poland, JRI Poland, which I use extensively when I'm doing research in Poland before I try to go to the archives. They've got an enormous amount of records that they've not only indexed, but they've got links to the actual records. It's not all the records in all of Poland, but it's a big chunk of them. And on-site archival research in Krakow, in Sanok, in Rzeszów, in Przemyśl. Those archives are just a fraction of the totality of the archival repositories that are available if you're trying to find relatives who were murdered during the Shoah. I really appreciate you inviting me here today, and I appreciate so much being able to not see all of you, but to share this story with you. I wish it could have been in person, but I'm really loving being able to be on Zoom and connecting with people from all over the world to share things like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janet. This was absolutely fascinating. I really feel that we are all indebted to you for all the information that you presented. So let me begin with a general question. Could you reflect a little bit about the relationship between genealogical research and history? How has genealogical research transformed the practice of Jewish history in general, and Holocaust studies in particular?
I grew up in a time where if you asked who were our relatives, who was our family before they came to the US, people would say, I don't know. If you said, I want to find out who they were, there's no records there. The towns were all wiped out. There's no records anyplace. Everybody's lost. We don't remember, we're not going to talk about it. That in itself is a tragedy. What we know from the digitization, from the modern ways that documents are treated for preservation, and also more modern documents besides the very old documents, that they're more accessible to people now than they had been. So we can find out about families. We can find out about towns. Records, yeah, sure, they were destroyed. Sometimes repositories were wiped out. But even in a place like Warsaw, which was almost completely destroyed during the war, of the 12 districts in Warsaw, there's still records from 6 of those districts. And they're findable. You might need to be on site to find them in Warsaw, but you can find a lot online. So to me, genealogy helps understand the history of a place because it becomes more personal. We all learned about the 6 million and more who were murdered during the Shoah. That's a big number. It's really impossible to get your head around. When you read Anne Frank's diary or any of the memoirs that were written, all of a sudden you've got a connection with a person. So you're learning history through their eyes. You're reliving pieces of their lives. You're able to drill into the specifics and then perhaps be able to take a step back and look at how those specifics fit into the larger puzzle of the history of a town, of a continent.
Yeah, and actually I like the word puzzle, because it seems that the work as you presented that to us, kind of from the bottom up, from the ground up, is highly, it's really the work of a detective. So what makes, in your view, what makes a good detective?
Not being satisfied with there's nothing there. I have researchers all over the world that are on site, that can go into archives, that can visit libraries, repositories, all sorts of places that we can't get digital records for. And they'll say to me, there's no records for this place. And I'll say to them, well, did you try looking at this other archive? Maybe all the records aren't in this one place. And they'll say, no, I didn't look for that. And then I'll say, oh, you're only looking for birth, marriage, death, and census records. What about letters in the Jewish community? What about these things? It's being able to attack the information that you have and trying to get down to bedrock. Little kids say, why? Don't touch the stove. Why? It's hot. Why? Because I turned the knob. Why? Because I wanted to cook. Little kids are always asking those why questions. Those questions are sort of obnoxious, and sometimes the kids are doing it to annoy us, but we need to learn from them. We need to be able to ask all of those questions. Why isn't this there? Are you sure it's not there? Who was this person? What does that record tell us? Is there a note on the record? I was looking at I was looking at some probate records, and somebody was contesting probate. They were claiming to be heirs of something, and they had presented some records, and those records were certified. And I looked at them and I said, that's very interesting, but those aren't the records. And they said, what do you mean? Of course they're the records. It says birth certificate on the top. I said, no, look at this. It's a form that somebody typed in information, and they didn't even type in all of the information from the birth record. And the guy said to me, how do you know that? And I said, because I have the birth record in my hand. And I see that some of the information on this form came from other records, and some of the information on this form is not what's on the original birth record. So one of the things that you need to do as a detective is always go searching for that original. Are you going to be content with a marriage record? Or are you going to look to see if there are bans that were posted? Yes, in Judaism, we also had bans posted for 3 weeks before a marriage took place. Is there a prenuptial agreement that was filed with a civil authority? Find the stuff, look for it. And if you can't find the stuff that you're looking for the person you're looking for, maybe you're going to find something 2 pages over for another person with that last name. And maybe you're going to find out that those people were related.
Mm-hmm. So those are some of the technical challenges. My last question would be, what are some of the emotional challenges that you face as a particular kind of a researcher, a genealogical researcher?
It's very difficult. I head up a team that specializes in Eastern European and Jewish research. Everybody on my team has an expertise doing research in various repositories all over Europe. My team speaks and reads documents in every imaginable European language. I'm the only one on my team who grew up with Jewish traditions. I grew up with Jewish traditions and then took those traditions into synagogue schools and taught in and managed religious schools and adult education and teen programs. And And I realized that we needed to connect emotionally, especially with the Shoah. We don't need to have everything focused on this tear-jerk reaction to the Inquisition, to the Shoah, to everything that came in between. Judaism is much richer than that, but we need to connect emotionally. We need to somehow find a connection, not even just with the Shoah, but with the people that came before. How would you feel if you found a record as a Jew whose family's from Eastern Europe, and you found a record from 1824 that's got a signature of your 5 times great-grandfather on it?
Mhm.
How does that make you feel?
Yeah. So this is absolutely fascinating. Let me open the conversation to the audience. Lisa, do we have questions that you can pose to Dr. Silverman?
We do have questions, and they are in the Q&A, but they are specific to individual searches. So I'm not sure if you want to take on individual search questions or if you want to make some sort of a generalized.
Well, why don't you throw a question or two out at me, and we'll see how that goes. I'm probably not going to be able to answer questions about specific towns or people, but there may be something in the question that'll help inform whoever's asking it.
Okay, so you'll excuse my pronunciation of places.
Oh, I can't pronounce them either, so.
But here we go. Where would you search for a Jewish orphan born in 1912 in Daruvar, currently Croatia, former Austro-Hungary? This is 2 years before the onset of World War I.
Well, it would depend on a variety of things. First, if you've got the town, you need to be possibly finding out first if there are records from that town that are held in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. And you can go to Family Search online and you can look in their catalog with the town name to see if they have any of the records. If they don't have any of the records there, and those records might be available digitally, you may very well need to be doing on-site research. But what you would need to do is using the person's birth date, you would need to be looking for anybody born in that town on that date and see if you could connect them. I would also, if you're a descendant of that person, or if that person still, well, I guess that person would not still be living, but if you're a descendant of that person, taking a DNA test and seeing who your DNA matches are might help you to narrow down who that person's family originally was by looking at the close cousin matches.
Great, thank you. The next one is, I have my grandfather's draft record, but I cannot find any of his relatives who were all assumed to be murdered in Munkacs, Berej,
Munchach.
Okay, you know it, Hungary. Where would you look to find records in these towns?
Well, the only place that you can go to find records from the towns are, like I said, the Family Search catalog to see if they've got those records. They've got a lot of records from Hungary that are available digitally. You're going to have to be able to read the languages. Although some of these languages may use Latin letters, like Hungarian and Polish, you may not be able to read the handwriting on them or the details of the information. You may not even be able to make out the person's name, because chances are it's not going to look like the name that you're familiar with.
Great. And the last question, well, there's 2 more questions. Where can I find declarations of intention, and maybe explain what a declaration of intention is?
So the naturalization process, until I think maybe around the 1950s, I don't know when it stopped being a 2-section process. The first papers that you filled out was a declaration of intention. It's a declaration of intention to naturalize. And then the second papers you fill out is a petition for naturalization. And there's a 5-year gap between when you arrived in the US and when you filled out the last papers. I always get this mixed up. I never remember if you have to be here for 3 years to fill out the declaration and then 2 years for the petition, or if it's 2 years for the declaration and then 3 years for the petition. Sorry, I always mix it up. If you know where somebody naturalized, you're in luck. But you might want to do some research. So you might want to research on Ancestry and see if you can find that person's naturalization record. If you can't find it in doing some searches in Ancestry, that might be fairly extensive because names are not unique. So you might find 30 different people with the same name that were all born about the same time period. And you'll have to figure out who actually is your relative. Ancestry has some of those naturalization papers. Fold 3 has some of those naturalization papers. Last thing you do is look at Family Search, and in their catalog, you want to look for naturalization, or you look for, probably start with the state and see if they have naturalization records in their catalog from that state. All of those naturalization records would be online on the Family Search website. And by the way, Family Search does require you to join. All you're doing is giving them your name. You're not giving them any money. You're not doing anything else. They just need your name so that, and you'll have a password so that you can sign into your account.
Great. How does one find local and reputable researchers in small shtetls of, I would say,
Volhynia.
Yeah.
So you don't. You hire me and my team, and we do that research. We have researchers literally all over the world on site to do the research in the archives. Most of the Jewish records from Ukraine are not indexed. You have to be in the archives, and you have to be going page by page in the books. We do a lot of research like that. We start out by verifying the information that you might have to make sure that the place and the dates and the name of your ancestor are sorted by other documentation. If the person didn't come to these, you might say, well, what's that documentation going to look like then? Well, you'd look at the name and the information for the person who was the immigrant to the US or wherever else they wound up. And look to make sure that they were actually from that town. Now, Volhynia is a province. There are many towns and districts in Volhynia, and the records in Eastern Europe are all going to be divided by town. The best the province does is it gets you into the main provincial archive. It doesn't get you into specific archives. It doesn't get you into the area in the archive that you need to be. You need to find a town. The town may very well be what you think it is, but you need to do that research before you head back into those archives.
What do you fill out when you arrive by ship in Canada?
Well, you don't fill out anything when you arrived by ship. The ship manifests were all filled out in Europe before the ships departed. So there were generally 2 sets of records. One is from the departure record, and most of those are either not digitized or didn't survive the years. The Red Line and the Hamburg and the Bremen departure manifests did. Arrival manifests exist in Canada and the US and also England. And if you're crossing the border, though, from Canada into the US, there'll be a separate set of documents that'll be filled out either by you or on your behalf from a customs official. But there's no documents that you're not filling out stuff on a ship manifest. That's all filled out by the ship's employees, for the departure manifest, for the arrival manifest by representatives of the US government or the Canadian government before it departed.
Great. And there's 2 more questions.
Sure.
One is there a list of those murdered in Auschwitz?
It depends on what you're looking for. Let me explain what happened. You arrived at the camps. If you died on the transport, or if you were sent to the gas chambers immediately on arrival, there's no record of you arriving there. If you stayed, worked, and or whatever they wanted to do with you, then you were then you had papers that admitted you to the camp, and there'd be files for you. But there are no files for an enormous amount of people. If you are on a transport, there might be a list of people on the transport, but if you died on the way or if you weren't registered into the camp, there's not going to be any record of you beyond that. It sounds, I'm trying to say these things as bluntly and as carefully as possible. I have a lot of trouble talking about a lot of the Holocaust research. I was doing a presentation last summer and I burst into tears in the middle of it and had to take a break because I just couldn't go any further. Talking about this and talking about what was perpetrated on our relatives, our family, there's no Jewish family in the world that wasn't touched to some degree by what happened from the 1930s into the 1940s, whether at the hands directly of the Nazis or collaborators, Ukrainians, Poles, and other people. I walk through the streets in Eastern Europe and I have a hard time not looking at the ground and imagining the ground with blood pouring all over it. It's really difficult to separate while you're talking about this stuff from the events. And all I'm doing is looking back 70 or 80 years at the event. I wasn't even there. So, yeah, sorry if that went off track.
No, that's great.
No, that's good.
And do you have any suggestions for looking for burial society records here in the US?
Well,
Did they even keep them?
well, you need to see where the burial society was incorporated. If you know, for example, where, like, I know that my grandparents were members of the first such of a Landsmannschaften. They've got a block over at, I think it's Beth David Cemetery out on Long Island. And there are poles sometimes, like a gate that has the names of the officers in the cemetery. The cemetery itself might have something that they can share with you, but generally these are corporations. If they're corporations, they had state paperwork. And you need to find what state they were incorporated in and what paperwork they provided to the state. A lot of these places are bankrupt or closed down. Plots that were unused went available to the larger population, not restricted just as they had been previously to people from those areas.
Great.
Sorry,
So-
there's no short answer.
Yeah.
There are no short answers.
The final question is more general, which is how do people hire you and your research team, and what is it cost prohibitive? Like,
Depends on what your wallet looks like.
yeah.
So you can email me at jsilverman@ancestry.com. My email address is on that slide that's in front of you. Our rates are high, quite high. We charge $125 an hour. And that rate's going up on January 1st to do research into Eastern European Jewish records. I won't take on a session for less than 50 hours. The retainer's paid upfront, generally by credit card. You receive a research agreement. If I've overestimated what the research is going to take, you receive the unused portion of the retainer back. Generally, it's going to take longer than that. You've got options of either continuing the research or saying, no, you've had enough. The deliverable includes copies of all the documents that we find. The documents are not in English. They are translated for you. If they are in English, you've got a transcription or an abstract of the document and citations so that you could know where we looked for the document. If you want to go back to those archives, you have that ability, and a research report that touches on the highlights. We also provide you with a new tree that we verify is correct, that we build on Ancestry while we're doing the research. Sorry, this was not supposed to be an advertisement.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
so
That concludes the questions.
yeah, good. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you all for joining us for this very fascinating and very highly informative session. I wish you all a safe and happy Hanukkah. And I look forward to seeing many of you in our programs next semester in the various conferences and the webinars that we are going to have. So thank you for your participation and have a wonderful evening.